welcome. This is episode 26 of Yves Just Chatting. And as you might have figured out by now, we have switched the format from German to English. And with that being said, we are now in the first English-speaking episode, so to say. This is due to multiple requests by people who said, it's like, we can follow along with the transcripts later on, but we would really love to see both the video stream as well as the video in a English-speaking format. So we are going to try this for a few episodes and then go back to see what actually fits our audience more. So the topic for today is based on a little video which I did a few days ago, where I said, are pilots potentially the better managers or entrepreneurs? And the reason behind that has been that I have been thinking quite a lot lately about the fact is, what is the difference between a pilot and many people in a managing scenario? And as I just started before we had the audio issue, is let's take the very simplistic scenario. Let's talk about the fact that we have a very small plane, a single engine plane. Even if you have a very simple single engine plane as the pilot, you might not have full control about the maintenance and everything else of the plane. So whilst before you take off, you run through your checklists and you validate everything and you make sure that everything is in good shape and the plane is ready to go. You are still depending on that these people have done the full job. So for example, many of you know that I have a pilot's license and I fly a Cirrus airplane. When I take that out of maintenance, then I'm not going to completely disassemble the engine again. Plus, to be realistic, I'm not necessarily 100% sure if that would be a good idea in the first place if I disassemble the engine and reassemble it. And the huge difference between flying a plane and driving a car or using many other ways of transportation is, by the point in time you're up in the air, you're basically on your own. So you need to be completely trusting the people on the ground, that they have done their preparations and everything perfectly well, that they have checked the engine and everything, that it's working. While you go through your checklist, there is a lot of things you're checking before you take off. But once you're up in the air, you're basically alone with your decision process. You might have, depending if you are flying a commercial airplane or something else, you might have a secondary pilot with you, so a co-pilot or the second in command. But even if you have that, it's always very clear who is responsible for which decision process and what you have to do. So as long as everything works on a plane or in an aircraft as normal, there is a normal flow of commands, there is a normal flow of operations, and that is very similar to how you operate a business or a corporation. So as long as everything runs smooth, everything is easy and everything is straightforward, and you basically can just follow along the route. As a pilot, depending on how you're flying, whether you're flying visual or instrumental, there might be differences whether you can decide your route or someone else does that. But in the end, even if you have air traffic control or anybody else, in the end, it's always the pilot's decision what he does in the end. Air traffic control can give you actually demands where they tell you, it's like, we want you to do the following, but in the end, you're on your own with your decisions. And this is basically back to how you run a corporation, whether it's a small one or a large one. It is very similar, because in the end, there will be tons of people who have very good ideas on how you should be doing it better. And this is especially when later on, even after aircraft incidents and stuff like that, especially if everybody survives, there is a lot of discussions what the pilot could have done better and what could have been better, especially the best scenario, if you ever have the chance, watch the movie about the water landing in New York a couple of years back, where they landed the Airbus on the Hudson River. There were tons of people later on who actually had better ideas on how to solve the situation. And the crew had to fight very hard to actually explain that their decision, based on the knowledge and everything they had, was the best to do. And this comes basically back to how you would run a scenario in a corporation as well, because very often in a business scenario, you need to work with the different challenges you are giving. You are giving with a set of informations, and based on that, it is expected from you that you take decisions. When a few years ago, I did a lot of CEO interviews also for LinkedIn, TikTok, and everything else. One of the most clear statements I got from nearly every CEO during that time period was that people said it's like, my daily job is I have to take decisions. Jeff Bezos actually made several statements, no matter how you stand to what Amazon does or anything else, when asked about what he does on a daily basis and what is the most important part of his role. It's where he said, it's like, I have to take decisions. I do not have to take hundreds of decisions, but I have to take decisions on a daily business. When I spoke to Raghu, who ran VMware for a good part, or when I speak to Pat Gelsinger and others, it's always the same story. Everybody keeps saying, it's like, I need to take decisions based on the information I have, and I need to take that decision at a very fast pace in many scenarios, because I don't have the time to spend and discuss that with a lot of people. And coming back to the pilot scenario, so let's play through the scenario. So you actually totally believed your ground crew on everything they prepared. You totally believed in what they told you, that the engines and everything is up and running. And then you take off with the plane. And everything runs as normal as you start, and everything else. You're up somewhere in the air. And all of a sudden, you have a problem with the engine. So at that point in time, whilst potentially you could pick up the radio and try to talk to the maintenance people if you can reach them, but potentially this is not going to solve your issue, depending on also how much time you have. So one of the first things you have to do as a pilot is get the plane back into normal controls. So you need to get the plane and the situation back into a safe haven in regards to that you at least gain time so that you can take a more serious decision. So in airplanes, that typically if you were to lose the complete engine, that means you're basically dropping the nose so that you gain speed, so that you can stay up in the air. Depending on which airplane you have, you would be surprised how far you can actually get with a plane even without an engine. So once you have brought the whole system back under your control and you're basically back in command, because once the engine actually decided to die, you were not out of command, but you had to deal with the situation. So the first thing is to do a quick fix to at least release the pressure out of it and to win time and then gain more information. The next thing you do is you try to run through the checklists, either in your head or ideally what the systems or whatever tell you, or a paper checklist, which then actually goes through a certain procedures which should help you to identify what's wrong and what isn't wrong. And while this is not exactly the same in a business scenario, you still have a pretty similar scenario in the business perspective, because in a business scenario, you have your own checklist in mind. What am I going to do? Let's play through a similar scenario. In a business scenario, you have a large customer, you onboarded them, you try to run through a large project with them, and all of a sudden you figure out, let's take the most extreme scenario, they are unable to pay. So at that specific case, you now need to take a very close look. Is like, what are my options? How can I work with this? So from a business perspective, so you now have a customer who is actually giving you the ability, or not giving you the ability, but basically giving you the information that they are currently unable to pay. The first thing you have to do, similar to dropping the nose for the airplane and actually gaining speed so that you can actually stay up longer and investigate the current situation, the first thing you have to do is in a situation like that, where you know that you have a customer which is not able to currently fulfill their requirements, which is paying the bill, you need to actually bring everything back in control and actually get to the point where you say, it's like, okay, so let's first try to reduce the impact for our corporation, but also for the other side, by going through and actually saying, it's like, okay, let's try to reduce the effort and everything we're throwing into it until we figure out what's wrong. You could immediately also say, hey, I'm going to stop everything. But in the end, you always need to think about what's in phase 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's not only about the fact, it's like, if I'm going to stop completely working on this, what's the impact for the customer? Because the customer might have a temporary issue where they currently can't pay. So your engine failure, to just compare it, might be temporarily. You might be able to restart the engine. If you were at this point in time immediately to just take the complete decision, hey, I'm going to basically, let's take the Cirrus airplane, for example. I have the ability to execute a rescue system, which is basically firing off a large parachute and actually bring the plane down to the ground. That would be too bad if I would figure out that I could have actually just restarted the engine if I have enough time. And that basically is the same when it comes to the business decision. You need to take a very, very close look and try to identify, is there a better option? Is that better option actually to restart the engine or to continue to work on this project and trying to help the customer get out of that situation and get better? The problem with these types of decisions is, in many cases, you will not have enough time. And whilst it's always good to have the ability to talk to other people about this, in the end, as the responsible, as the manager or anything else, it's your responsibility to take that decision in the end. And this is what, when I look at many corporations nowadays, this is what I see very often people are lacking of. No one wants to take a real decision from that perspective. And no one wants to then actually be responsible for it. It is, by the way, not necessarily it is not necessarily a scenario which is especially territorial, like for Europe or anything else. I actually have seen this challenge even bigger in the US than it is here in Europe, where instead of that, people are willing to take, especially managers, whether it's top or medium or lower level managers, where people do not want to actually take a decision by themselves. They build large working groups, they invite tons of people into it, they want to have a long discussion about it. And in the end, my feeling is very often to not necessarily only have that discussion to just get the opinion of everybody else to take a more serious decision out of it. The reason behind that in many cases is far more often that people can later on pinpoint the finger at individual people and say, it's like, but I didn't take the decision on my own. It was the whole group. So the whole group is basically failing with it. And this is why I say it's like, it would be better off or many managers would be better off if they were behaving like pilots. So you can actually collect the information from other people. Let's think about a larger plane. You can actually ask if someone else, if your co-pilot has an opinion, if basically someone back in the plane has heard something, some noises on the engine, depending on what capabilities you have and what plane you have. But in the end, it's your decision to take. And this is, again, what you see, as I said, in many corporations. Constantly, people are trying to invite a lot of people into discussions and meetings. And one of the things which I also learned from working with companies like AWS and others is they have a different meeting culture. So when you have ever read a Jeff Bezos strategy on why he doesn't like any PowerPoints in meetings, why he has a different approach to meetings, while it's from that perspective, one of the first things is people who cannot actually actively help with the situation should leave a meeting in the first place. And that also reduces the amount of people influencing it, because the problem is, let's say I invite 10 people into a meeting. So if I invite 10 people into a meeting, that somehow gives all of these 10 people the feeling that everybody has to say something on a topic, even if it's not relevant for them, they don't really have an opinion on it, or they cannot actually judge the situation. If you're working with people at Amazon, for example, you will very often see that they are just actually there to and actually visit their meeting for the first few minutes, then they leave again because they are not actually generating anything. There was just a quick comment. What about meetings without an agenda? Meetings without an agenda is something we try to get rid of within Comdivision as much as we can. Because the problem with if you run meetings without any agenda is very often that it becomes more like a talk at the water cooler or at the coffee machine, because they don't lead to any results from that perspective. So as much as you can as a corporation and as a small or medium-sized business, don't run meetings just for running meetings. It's, for example, many corporations in the last couple of years have also, or especially in the last, I would say 12, 18 months, have started motions where they say it's like, for example, fixed meetings and quarterly meetings and monthly meetings and weekly meetings and stuff like that get reduced to the bare minimum. There are certain types of meetings which just help everybody. If you have a highly remote team, like a weekly or bi-weekly get together where everybody gives a quick status update on what they are working on, but try to keep these meetings as short as possible. This is not a chit-chatting meeting where people should just come in and actually tell their life story. You can have different opinions on that, but just a very brief scenario. So we in Comdivision, for example, have a Friday morning meeting, which is set up for, I think, 30 minutes. We have to cover much more than just 50 or 60 projects in that. And so this gives you a very clear idea. There is not even 1 minute per specific project. So we really need to get through all of these line items very, very fast. And if there is no news, there is no news, no nothing to talk about. And I think this is something which is in the last couple of years has become worse and worse in corporations, where people just actually have meetings for the sake of meetings. I, for example, a few years ago started to work for a large US corporation with a Comdivision team. And as the project was kicked off for the first week, I got more or less a calendar page for the whole week with all the meetings being set up. And I looked at it and I basically said, so what is this? And the response was, this is all the meetings we have set up for this week. And I said, it's like, I understand we're kicking off this project, but why are we spending more or less 6 to 8 hours every day in meetings? This is, on one hand, not very productive. And on the other hand, this is not going to lead to any outcomes or results. And so we sat down and we cut down, I think, over 80% of these meetings, where we said, it's like, okay, this is just to learn or meet new people. Let's actually meet together during lunch break or coffee break and actually get to know these people, but we don't need to set up a 30 minutes meeting to actually get this done. Another good example on how to reduce meetings was I was working in London with a larger UK bank. Or was it? No, it was the bank. And during that meeting, we thought about the fact that, or I actually looked at the wall, and there was not a clock at the wall, there was basically a money counter at the wall. And something which a lot of people totally underestimate is how much does every meeting cost a company, let alone the time which is lost out of it. But imagine you have 5 people in a room, each would actually normally charge the customer $2,000 a day in a daily rate. And you're basically blocking these resources for hours. Then you can make up the math on how much are you wasting by having 2 hours of completely useless meetings with all these people, let alone the room costs and everything else. Plus you need more people to actually do that. So one of the things which is, I think, when you have ever worked with a group of pilots, is that many of them will not necessarily have a lot of fun in these meetings and try to cut them short. And this is because they are used to very quickly analyze the situation at hand and come to a solution, come to a conclusion, and then basically work with the results out of it. There is a statement again from, I'm not sure if it was Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, where the whole discussion was that how should you deal with the fact that you're running into, or that a meeting is set up, and it's completely useless for everybody. And then you should cancel the meeting immediately. There is no reason to actually keep that meeting up and running if there is no outcome. So every meeting, when it comes to that, should have a clear starting point and a result. Coming back to the pilot situation, one of the other things which pilots are good in is pilots very early on learn that throughout the cycle of flying, you take a decision and you stick with that decision. Which doesn't mean that you cannot make a correction. So, for example, I am deciding that I'm going to airport A and I'm flying in that direction. I have my routing and everything else. Hello, to those who just joined. So I'm flying to airport A and I'm trying to actually get there. On the way, either air traffic control or myself, I figure out there is a huge thunderstorm in the middle. At that specific point in time, I'm not going to fly through that thunderstorm. Whether I'm having a small plane or even large planes, typically try to avoid things like that because they can become very, very nasty. I mean, with a small plane, you should avoid it even further. But even with a large plane, pilots are basically trying to avoid that. There is a question where I'm from. I'm basically from Germany. I'm currently sitting in Germany, but we started to move this format into an English-speaking format. So as we go along from the pilot's story, so that would be a perfect scenario where I would take the decision that I'm going to change my route, and that might still lead to the airport A, which I wanted to go to, but it might also be the result that I'm going to an airport B. Why am I taking that decision? Because everything else would just clearly be, let's call it like that, stupid. Flying into a thunderstorm is not the best idea. It's basically calling for trouble. And that's the same in a business perspective. If you take a decision, then you actually take that decision and you stick with it and you work with it. One of German's, let's say entrepreneurs, Mr. Grupp, who actually runs Trigema, which is only potentially known for German companies, is known for a very, very similar statement where he said, it's like, if I'm actually coming back to our factory at 9 p.m. in the evening because they were producing fabrics on a 24-hour basis. If he comes into the fabrication place at 9 p.m. in the evening and someone in production would ask him, is like, which color should we actually use for now? This is the point where he said, it's like, this is where he needs to take a decision, where he needs to decide, are we going to produce blue, red, or green, or whatever else next? And he might not have all the information, but it's important that he takes the decision, because otherwise everybody would actually be sitting around and can't actually get any work done. So even if his decision in producing green shirts is wrong because he needs blue shirts the next day, at least he would have green shirts. If he wouldn't take any decision at all, he wouldn't have any shirts on the next day, whether they are green or blue. So it's up to him to actually take a decision, whether it's maybe the wrong one, but at least that decision allows the company to move on and actually get to the next stage and actually produce something. Once he has taken the decision and actually said, it's like, hey, let's produce green shirts, he can then actually walk away and try to find the necessary information to really understand what exactly is the plan, or how did we get it, potentially call up some people or figure out what exactly is behind that. And so then he can, worst case, turn around. He would not then say, it's like, stop the green production. I mean, he could, but that's most likely not what he would have done. As he was walking through some of these examples, he would then actually say, it's like, okay, continue and finish off the green line. Once the green line is done, produce the blue line, because we figured out we need blue next. So that very simplistic example is something which a lot of corporations nowadays are lacking of, because in many corporations, especially when you look into large corporations in the US, but I have seen the same in Germany when you look at banks or large automotive companies or everything else, very often people would be willing to stop the process just because they might take the wrong decision. Coming back to the pilot scenario, if I'm losing an engine, if I only have one engine and I'm losing that engine, there is nothing for me where I can actually say it's like, oh, I'm getting off the plane. I'm actually going to think about this for a few hours, and then we come up with a solution for it. I need to come up with a solution now because situation has changed. I now have to fix the current situation at hand and basically come up with a solution. So this is one of these scenarios where I would say, especially in modern times, in many cases, pilots would be better managers, or for many managers, or especially entrepreneurs or C-levels, it might be a good idea for them to actually make a pilot's license, because one of the things you have to learn very, very fast there is taking decisions and sticking with them. Other things which pilots are a lot better is a safety evaluation. So, because even though the pilot, as they are flying, it's in many cases, especially when we talk about commercial pilots or something like that, it's not their personal plane. And the airport is not them. There is a lot of things they are moving, or they could be actually damaging, or anything else which is not theirs. But in the end, there is one more important part out of it. And that more very important part out of it is that people need to understand that once you're up in the air, you're again alone with your decision, and you want to get back on the ground because you want to be alive in the end. So pilots need to take all necessary safety precautions before they actually take off, before they start the plane, before they potentially take passengers with them up in the air. So very early on, even if you see the most experienced pilots, you will see that they do a pre-briefing, that they do flight preparations, that they do all of these things. Yes, they become faster and quicker over time. So when I look at it, when I did my pilot's license, for example, trying to do the navigation planning was a lot more effort than today. And yes, electronics have helped over the last couple of years. When I think about when I did my first pilot's license in the age of 17, back then you had to do planning based on maps and everything. There was not that much of an option. Yes, we had first GPS systems, but they were completely unreliable. So we were depending on having all these other tools. When I'm nowadays preparing things, I can basically do all of that preparation on the back of an iPad and actually can start preparing that. Nevertheless, when it comes to the airport, I still need to do my checks on the airplane and everything else. Because no matter if you have started with the same plane 15 times, 20 times in the last week, something could have changed. And this is something which you potentially cannot correct in the air. And when we look at modern managers, modern C-levels and people like that, it's exactly the same situation. For them, many of them are not basically owning the companies. And this is potentially one big part of the problem. When we in Germany, when we compare enterprises from, let's say, medium-sized or the typical, in Germany, we call it Mittelstand. And that has not necessarily something to do with the size of the corporation. That has very often something to do what's the ownership relationship. In many cases, you will see that a lot of these companies are family owned or owned by a group of families or something like that. So for them, there is a high risk at stake. So if something goes wrong, they are in it. Whereas, as much as everybody always keeps saying is they have so much in their back pocket, you would be surprised how deep in liability many of these families are. So they will take decisions on a completely different level. They will take decisions primarily based on security decisions. So in many cases, they are far more near to the pilot scenario, although at the same point in time, they lack decision willingness from that perspective. But when we go through this specific scenario, you can see that there is a difference between them and other corporations, where someone is just actually managing someone else's money. So if you are a managing director or even a C-level in a company which you don't own and they don't have a stake in, the maximum risk you are talking about is that you might lose your job. And in many cases, that does not even mean that you are not getting a new job in the next couple of weeks or months. So they are willing to take risks, which they would never ever take if it would be their own company or their own money at risk from that perspective. And that is potentially also why we have this mixture of decision processes. On one end, people don't want to take a decision because they don't want to be responsible for it by themselves. So they want to have as many other people involved in the decision process, so that in the end there is a group, a large group, as large as possible, which is the responsible people behind it. And on the other side, even if something goes wrong, is basically there is more or less no risk. And when you again come back to the scenarios where you have companies which are in family ownerships and these family members are actively working in the companies, they are far more behaving like the pilot who in the end wants to get safe back on the ground by himself as well, and who don't want to risk the scenario that they might completely lose their life and the life of others on the plane as well. So there is a huge difference. So looking back from that perspective, pilots are actually much better to follow safety precautions before they take decisions. Pilots are much better to evaluate the situation before they take off. So think about it from a company's perspective. Before a company would actually launch a new product or actually even start investing in building a new product, there's a lot more safety precautions a pilot would do initially. So there would be more research and everything in the beginning, where some other people would just say, it's like, let's just get started. We will figure it out on the way. As a pilot, you cannot figure it out on the way. If I don't take enough fuel, there is no one, as long as I'm not flying a fighter jet where I can potentially refuel in the air, for everybody else, there is no refueling in the air. And if I do not even have enough air fuel to actually get to the next airport, there is basically no turning back for me if I figure that out too late. So there are a lot of these decisions or a lot of these scenarios where you have to think about these multiple times before you actually get to a decision. And this, in the end, basically, as we are looking through it, these are the main reasons why I think, in the end, pilots would be, in many cases, better managers, because on one end, the security precautions before they start something. On the other hand, the clear line of when they take a decision, they are working with a decision, they are taking the decision to the end. They might make adjustments to the decision, but overall, the generic decision is taken and is going to be executed. Another scenario for a pilot is, once a pilot has declared emergency and wants to do an emergency landing, there are very rare scenarios where pilots would call this off. And this is very simplistic because you're following a routine from there on, and that is more or less the same in a business perspective. So when it comes down to a conclusion, what I would expect or what I would hope more from managers is, the reason why you are in a managing or leading position is that people are depending on you, that you take decisions, that you stick to decisions, and that you work with the consequences. And whilst the consequences might not always be personal loss of money or anything else, think about it as if it would be your own money, if it would be your own company. And I think that would help. When we look at large corporations and a lot of, let's say, bad decisions being taken, it is in many cases because people have nothing to lose. When I currently look at some other companies also in the IT space, and I'm not talking about the VMware Broadcom scenario here at the moment, but a lot of, let's say, also larger professional service and reseller companies, at the moment, a lot of them, you can see that the management in many cases does not necessarily really care, because all they know is, if something goes wrong, company might actually fire me. I'm going to run around for 3, 4, 5 months, and then I will have a new position. And I think this is also something which we need to fix, that people are willing to take more responsibility. That will also lead to a better leadership position, because from that perspective, people who are joining you, people who are actually with you on that journey, will more likely be in the position that they are actually trusting and believing in you, because you're basically showing them the way you're going to take. That does not mean, coming back to the pilot scenario, that you should not listen to other people. So, for example, if someone comes along and actually says like, hey, have you thought about restarting the engine, to come back to our scenarios from before? Then potentially you might have missed that step on the plan for whatever reason. Then it's good to listen to them and actually say, it's like, yep, thought about that, or no, I didn't thought about that. Good idea. Let's work on that. And in that specific reason, take that person or that decision. So that's it, more or less, for today's show. Again, write in the comments, as we are going to post the videos or the podcast, what you think. Should actually pilots be the better managers? Should a pilot's license maybe a requirement for a certain level of management? And how do you think about people lacking the will to take a decision in most corporations, or the attempt to do that? Hope to see you again soon. I will be recording the next session next Monday again. There might be shorter sessions in between, but the next main session is going to be hosted next Monday again, 8:30 p.m. German time. And during that session, we are going to talk about the topic whether it's better to pick the job based on salary or passion. Again, I made a few short videos, and there will be a few short videos on TikTok and other platforms in the next coming days, preparing for that session so that you can ramp up some questions for that specific topic. It's really going to be talking about some of the challenges we see in the current workforce at the moment, and why people are so demanding on work-life balance, and whether that has something to do with your job decision in the first place, whether you're working for your passion or anything else. But I'm not going to cover that now. Hope to see you again next Monday, same time, same slot. We are going to be on all platforms, and then if you want to later on listen into this one, it's going to be published in the next couple of days on many different podcast platforms. Hope to see you next week. Thank you and goodbye.